height and broke my fall and on my back, and man, my heart was pounding like that. But I realized I'm still alive. So John comes over and...
There was a contrast between the black sky of the moon and the brightness of the lunar surface. It was an incredible contrast. That's Charlie Duke's own description of the first thing that hit him after he stepped onto ground almost no human being has ever stood on. Days later, on that same surface, one wrong move mid-jump left him falling backward with about a minute of air standing between him and nothing at all. He survived it and kept walking, one of only 12 people who've ever set foot on the moon, the youngest of them all. This is what he actually saw up there, in his own words. Who was flying? Charlie Duke. Before Apollo 16. Before Charlie Duke ever set foot on the moon, millions of people already knew his voice. They just didn't know his face. To understand how that happened, it helps to start where he did, decades before any of it. He was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, in October of 1935, into a world where spaceflight didn't exist yet as a career or as anything else. When he graduated from the Naval Academy in 1957, no astronaut program existed anywhere on Earth. He was commissioned into the Air Force that same year and sent overseas, and he was stationed in Germany in 1961 when Yuri Gagarin and Alan Shepard became the first human beings to leave the atmosphere. He watched the beginning of the space race from the outside with no clear door in. The door opened at MIT. Duke returned to the United States in 1962 to pursue a master's degree in aeronautics, and during his second year there, he found himself working directly on the Apollo guidance and navigation system, the exact technology that would eventually fly astronauts to the moon and back. It was in those labs that he crossed paths with astronauts monitoring the same system's development. Their energy for the job did something his coursework hadn't managed. It made him ask how a person actually became one of them. The answer ran through test pilot school, the same pipeline that had produced nearly every astronaut NASA had picked so far. Duke graduated in 1965 and briefly stayed on as an instructor there, sharpening the exact skill set NASA was looking for. The math was simple in his own mind. The best job a test pilot could hope for was becoming an astronaut. So when NASA opened recruitment, he volunteered. In April of 1966, he was selected into the agency's 5th astronaut group, one of 19 pilots chosen that year, at a moment when the entire Apollo program was still unproven and every one of its early flights carried real, unresolved risk. His first real assignments put him close to the center of that risk without putting him inside the spacecraft. He served on the astronaut support crew for Apollo 10, the mission that flew a full dress rehearsal of a lunar landing without actually touching down, testing every system short of the final descent. It was preparation for the mission that would define his early career, even though he wasn't flying on it. That mission was Apollo 11, the flight tasked with actually landing the first humans on the moon. By 1969, Duke had become the capsule communicator, known simply as CAPCOM, the single voice authorized to speak directly to the crew from Mission Control in Houston during that landing. That role put him at the center of the most dangerous minutes in the entire Apollo program, and almost nobody watching the broadcast that day knew his name. As Neil Armstrong guided the lunar module down toward the surface, guidance errors had steered them directly into a field of boulders large enough to destroy the spacecraft on landing. Armstrong flew past it manually, burning fuel nobody had planned to lose, and Mission Control fell into total, unbroken silence. Then Buzz Aldrin, the mission's second astronaut aboard the lunar module, broke that silence over the radio. Contact, engine stop. A moment later, Armstrong's own voice followed. Houston, Tranquility Base here. the Eagle has landed." Duke's reply became one of the most human seconds of the entire broadcast. He was so overwhelmed, he mangled the word tranquility into twang before catching himself and confirming contact from the ground. Years later, he'd admit exactly how close to the edge he'd been standing that whole time, holding his breath for the better part of a minute without fully realizing he was doing it. He'd just helped guide 2 men to the first landing on another world, live in front of the entire planet without ever leaving his chair in Houston, and none of the recognition that followed would belong to him. What he got instead was his own turn to go. The mission 3 years and 4 flights after Apollo 11, Duke finally had his own mission, and it wasn't going to look like the ones that came before it. Apollo 16 was the 5th crewed landing on the moon, but by the time it launched in April of 1972, NASA had already learned enough from earlier flights to attempt something more ambitious. Apollo 11, 12, and 14 had all explored on foot, close to relatively flat landing zones, chosen mainly to minimize risk. Apollo 16 aimed higher, literally targeting the lunar highlands, a rougher, more elevated region of the moon's surface that no earlier mission had attempted to reach. The specific site was the Descartes region, chosen because scientists expected to find volcanic rock there, a hypothesis that would turn out to be wrong in a way that reshaped lunar geology entirely, though Duke and his crew didn't know that yet. Getting there safely meant assembling a crew built specifically for the terrain. John Young served as mission commander, Ken Mattingly as command module pilot, remaining in lunar orbit throughout the surface mission, and Duke as lunar module pilot, the role that would put him on the ground. None of them treated science as an afterthought. Duke and Young trained so extensively in geology that Duke later estimated the 2 of them had accumulated the equivalent of a master's degree in the subject by launch day. That training wasn't confined to a classroom. In 1971, NASA sent the pair to Sudbury, Ontario, a real crater landscape on Earth, to walk terrain that looked and behaved like what they'd find on the moon, so that once they were standing on the actual lunar surface, identifying rock formations wouldn't be guesswork. But even after years of preparation, the mission nearly didn't happen the way anyone planned. As the spacecraft approached the moon, a malfunction in the command module's main engine forced mission control to delay the landing entirely. Mattingly worked the problem alone in lunar orbit, out of radio contact for long stretches as he passed behind the moon's far side, while Duke and Young waited without knowing whether the mission would be scrubbed. Duke's own description of that wait captured exactly how it felt from inside the spacecraft. If your heart can sink to the bottom of your boots in 0 gravity, ours did. Mattingly eventually fixed the problem, and the delay held. What should have been a straightforward descent toward the Descartes highlands now carried the weight of everything that could still go wrong. One more obstacle standing between Duke and a landing site nobody had planned or trained for the way it would actually appear. The view. Nobody expected. That was the other problem with Descartes. It hadn't just gone untested by an engine failure. It had gone almost entirely unseen. Even with the delay behind them, Duke's approach to the moon's surface was never going to be routine, because nobody had ever actually seen the ground he was about to land on. The best available photography of the Descartes landing site only resolved details down to about 45 feet, which meant anything smaller than that. And there were plenty of craters and boulders that qualified, was effectively invisible until the lunar module was already flying over it. Duke described the landing itself as the most demanding part of the entire mission from a pilot's seat, not because of any single dramatic failure, but because he was reading and reacting to terrain features in real time that no map or photograph had shown him in advance.
Moon. I'm on the moon. And the excitement, the wonder, the thrill, the adventure, of it all.
Then the module touched down, and Duke stepped out onto ground no human had stood on before. His first reaction wasn't relief. It was disbelief. "I'm really here. I'm finally on the moon," he said, the years of training suddenly compressed into a single, physical fact. What followed was something closer to being overwhelmed. He described wonder, awe, being overcome with the beauty of the moon, the desolation, language that echoed what Buzz Aldrin had called magnificent desolation 3 years earlier. A landscape that was somehow both beautiful and completely empty at once. The surface itself defied what photographs had prepared him for. Gray and rougher than expected, stark in a way no two-dimensional image could fully carry. Duke wasn't seeing a picture anymore. He was standing inside the actual place, and the difference, by his own account, was enormous. What the rocks revealed. The surprise waiting at Descartes wasn't just visual the way the landscape itself had been. Before the mission ever launched, Ken Young would find in the highlands volcanic rock, the kind that would fit tidy assumptions about how that part of the moon had formed. It was a reasonable guess, built on the best data available at the time, but it was also wrong. What Duke and Young actually pulled out of the ground were breccias, rock formed not by volcanic activity, but by ancient impacts, fragments of earlier collisions fused back together under tremendous pressure and heat. It rewrote assumptions about the region in real time, based entirely on what two astronauts were seeing and physically handling from the surface. Duke's own summary of the reaction back on Earth was simple. The geologists were excited. That discovery didn't happen by luck. It happened because the training from Sudbury, Ontario, had actually paid off. Duke and Young weren't just collecting rocks to bring home for someone else to analyze later.
In New Mexico, we had a rover. We were the second crew to have a rover.
They were identifying what they were looking at while they stood there, inside spacesuits, on a 16-mile stretch of terrain covered using the lunar rover, a range no earlier. Footbound mission had come close to reaching into a full geological survey of ground nobody had studied up close before. That same rover of highland terrain was about to put Duke somewhere his training had never actually prepared him to look straight up toward home, looking back at Earth. For all the ground Duke covered on the lunar surface, there was one thing he almost never got to see while standing on it. Earth itself. From the Descartes landing site, Earth sat almost directly overhead, and that positioning turned out to matter more than anyone had planned for. Duke's spacesuit helmet wasn't built for looking straight up. Trying to catch a glimpse of home meant staring into the inside of his own helmet instead, what he described simply as looking at the opaque side of your helmet. The single most famous image people associate with the Apollo missions. An astronaut gazing up at a blue Earth hanging in a black sky wasn't something Duke experienced while his boots were actually on the ground. That view belonged to a different part of the mission entirely. In lunar orbit, on the way in and again on the way back, Earth was fully visible, and by Duke's own account, it was unforgettable. It seemed like you could hold out your arm and cover the Earth with your hand, he said, describing polar ice caps in pure white against clouds drifting across brown land and blue ocean below. He called it that jewel of blue, white, and brown, suspended in the blackness of space, a single sentence carrying more weight than any photograph NASA ever released from the mission. Earth was the last thing Duke could see clearly and safely from a distance. What came next put him close enough to lose everything in a single fall. The moment he nearly died, 1972, also happened to be an Olympic year, with Munich hosting the Games that summer, and late in their surface stay, Duke and Young decided the moon deserved its own version. It started as nothing more than a way to pass a few final minutes on the surface, testing what the body could do in gravity 1/6 as strong as Earth's. Duke went first with the high jump, and it worked, at least at first. He cleared roughly 4 feet off the surface, an impressive height by any measure, made possible only by how little the moon actually pulled at him. But he made one mistake.
My center of gravity went backwards, and over I went.
Mid-jump, he straightened his body instead of staying compact, and the backpack strapped to him, the one holding his entire life support system, more than doubled his effective mass in that position, tipping him backward with no time left to correct it. He fell straight onto the pack itself. The stakes weren't exaggerated for drama. That backpack was covered by a fiberglass shell holding his oxygen, his regulators, his electrical systems, everything keeping him alive on a surface with no breathable air at all. In Duke's own words, years later, the danger was simple and absolute. If it broke, I was dead. A crack in that shell wouldn't have meant an injury. It would have meant losing his air supply within seconds. Unconscious before Young could even reach.
All right, Charlie.
He landed hard and rolled instinctively to absorb the impact, then lay there, listening for the sound of the pumps still running inside the pack. The only way to know whether he'd actually survived his own stunt. They were running. Young walked over, looked down at him, and delivered the driest possible verdict. That wasn't very smart, Charlie. Duke asked for a hand up and got quite fast. It wasn't his only stumble on that surface. He also fell forward, trying to plant a scientific instrument into the ground, and tripped again, reaching down for a pair of tongs after dropping a hammer moments earlier. None of those falls carried the same stakes as the high jump, but together, they told the same story. Even a test pilot with years of training could be caught completely off guard by a world where gravity simply didn't behave the way 70 years of instinct expected it to. What he left to be found later. By the time the surface stay was winding down, Duke had one more thing to do before leaving the moon behind. Something that had nothing to do with geology at all.
Take this picture of the moon. He said, sure. And I said, I'd like to leave it on him. And he said, sure. So
he'd carried a family photograph with him, showing himself, his wife Dottie, and their 2 young sons. And before climbing back into the lunar module for the last time, he set it down on the surface and left it there. Duke has explained exactly why he brought it in the first place. Before the mission, he'd asked his kids if they wanted to go to the moon with him. And the photograph was his way of making that true, so the whole family could say they'd made the trip together. On the back, he'd written a simple inscription identifying who they were, and when they'd landed, a message meant for whoever or whatever might eventually find it. The moon didn't preserve it the way he might have pictured. Surface temperatures at the landing site reached roughly 230 degrees Fahrenheit, and the plastic casing protecting the photo began shriveling almost immediately after he set it down. What Duke left behind wasn't a photograph frozen in time. It was already changing the moment he walked away from it. But the photo wasn't the only thing he left there. A patch of cloth marked with his test pilot school class number went down beside it, along with a medallion commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Air Force's founding. Small physical pieces of a life left behind, on ground, with no wind, no rain, and nothing to ever disturb them. Decades later, that same spot became visible again, not to human eyes, but to a camera. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter eventually photographed the Apollo 16 landing site from lunar orbit, capturing the exact ground Duke had once stood on, and the objects he'd left scattered across it. Duke has called it a strange thing to look at, seeing his own landing site again, decades after leaving it, in an image taken by a machine that hadn't even been built when he was there. Duke never set out to make history. In his own words, it was always about the love of exploration, the love of flight, the adventure of spaceflight. More than 50 years later, he still says he'd go back, if only out of curiosity, to see what's left of the place he once stood.